In this third lecture, I want to discuss one of the most famous intellectuals of the 20th century, one of the few intellectuals to actually become a kind of international star, and that's Jean-Paul Sartre, a French philosopher from my decade, my period, the 60s, but whose career lasted longer than that and started before that, and in many ways whose journey as both an intellectual and an activist marks out a certain search for meaning in the 20th century in his own life. In other words, his own life story is interesting in that regard, apart from the works that he wrote. The best introduction here, given that my last lecture was on Heidegger, is to explain that there was a profound misunderstanding between Sartre and Heidegger over what was going on. Sartre was, as many of you out there know, the popularizer of existentialism in a series of essays and novels and plays that were I think, excellent literature. And the existentialism, one of its sources at least, was Heidegger. But for Sartre, he had misunderstood Heidegger in the way that some of the questions at the end of the last lecture might indicate. Sartre had read Heidegger's account of human being in the world, human Dasein, as a form of humanism. So Sartre wrote a famous essay called Existentialism is a Humanism, to which Heidegger replied, nothing could be, sort of further from the truth. What I'm interested in, Heidegger said, is more the way that language speaks us. In other words, the way that the languages we learn and the cultures into which we are, brought up, the way that they end up interpolating our lives. And you've interpreted me as saying that my only project is how we reform them. And so this misunderstanding, though, in my view, cuts very nicely in Sartre's direction. And the reason it does is, misunderstanding or not, it gives Sartre a very different project. One that I'm sure as soon as I mention the word, and I've already mentioned it in the title, you'll all be familiar with, and that's the project of trying to find a way to live in which one might say of oneself that you are free. In fact, the two phases into which Sartre's career are divided, both are attempts to travel this road to freedom. One is, as a young man, Sartre, as an existentialist, and I'll try to explain that term briefly in a moment. Many of you are familiar with it already. And then later, after the existentialist so-called period, although I think that Sartre in some sense maintains those views throughout his life, or at least a set of them, then there's Sartre, the one that Americans are much less familiar with, because we are unfamiliar with this intellectual tradition in Europe, and that's Sartre the Marxist. In fact, this was outrageous to many of his early admirers that he would become a revolutionary Marxist, because in the United States that always had been associated with Soviet-style bureaucratic Marxism, and of course then you began to think about the Cold War and all the little films you saw in grade school of Russian kids with their hands hanging on barbed wire and all that stuff, which actually wasn't a mode of thought, but was just our mode of propaganda. It doesn't mean it wasn't better than their propaganda. Events have proven it was better. But in any case, this second period in Sartre's development as a revolutionary Marxist is less well understood, and I'm going to try to say a little bit about both. The reason I want to do this is that our general theme is the self under siege, and no one more than Sartre, I think, in the intellectual world, in the world of ideas and books, fought harder to maintain a sense of self. The themes of existentialism is, as you may recall, it's a principal concern I've already raised in Heidegger, although, as I say, not in the way Sartre would raise it. It has concern with a series of concepts that today would be, I think if you were to discuss them today, for example, at the mall, you would just be called someone who's very depressing. And if you went to your psychiatrist, they would probably just give you some Prozac and hope things worked out. Because the existential concepts are anxiety, despair, and death, and these array of concepts. Let's see. I come up with some others, you know, but those are a handful, I think, that'll give you an idea of where the existentialist project. This was not a interestingly enough, a philosophy that was worked out in lengthy volumes or tomes. I mean, it's clear Heidegger didn't view his work as existentialism, and except for a few essays, Sartre's own work would not be adequately characterized this way. It became popular in the United States precisely in the context of a cultural search for meaning. So the ways in which you're familiar with Sartre's existentialism, again, probably won't be from reading the books that Sartre wrote, but from the cultural artifacts produced out of that mood of existentialism. And there you could name dozens of movies, plays, novels, and cinema produced with that mood, with moods of despair, anxiety, and with the structural problem, you know, this anxiety before death and meaninglessness. Another famous concept out of this same set is the concept of the absurd by Camus. And I want to mention it briefly before I proceed on to Sartre. The absurd for Camus is that circumstance within which we frequently encounter when, for example, somebody who's 25 is hit by a brick that falls off a building, you know, and then somebody like Ronald Reagan, who's 80, is shot in the chest with an exploding bullet and lives, and we go, that's absurd, you know. I mean, it's the sense that our life hangs on the same kind of contingencies that dice hang on, you know. Like you roll 11 and it's lights out, otherwise keep playing. That sense makes your life feel absurd. I mean, this is not, again, you can see why existentialism had popularity as a cultural phenomenon, because these are issues that traditional philosophers didn't address in this way. Why is existentialism even possible? Well, in spite of the fact that there were so-called religious existentialists, it took this whole background that I at least tried to explain in the first lecture. The secularization of society and the suspicion about its ultimate meaning that goes along with abandoning certain simplistic views of God that open up fears about death. I mean, this is what opens up the human experience to anxiety, despair, dread, and the absurd.